Good afternoon, Ian.
Good afternoon.
We're sitting in the Commonwealth Games head office. It's a fantastic place. This is 2022, just in case somebody listens to this years later. This is the year that Birmingham, the city of Birmingham, is going to be transformed. This is the year when the world will be watching Birmingham. And you are at the helm of it. You are sitting right on the top. And you're going to have to ensure that whatever happens between now and it culminates, is it 8th of August?
The sport finishes on the 8th of August, yes.
And then on the 8th of August, you'll be able to breathe a sigh of relief and say, job done. So let's kick off. Now, for those who don't know Ian Reid, and we know him well here. So Ian was, and I think the accent may have given it away, Ian was CFO of the Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games. So that was 2009 to 2015. So 6 years, you had a real good idea of how these Commonwealth Games work. You looked after corporate services, support functions, finance, legal, procurement, HR, program management, office management. Big, lot of things to do. You procured, and this is always important for businesses, is you procured £250 million worth of goods and services. And that's important because that's part of the legacy.
Of course.
And if we get a chance, we'll just pick that up a bit later on. 1,500 staff, that's a lot of people. And of course, previous to that, you were head of commercial finance at AG Bar PLC. And a board member of Funkin Cocktails Limited. That's interesting.
Indeed.
There we go. So I think I know why you're here. And I think I know why you've came originally from Glasgow, I'm guessing, into Birmingham. And you are going to make sure the Commonwealth Games goes without a hiccup. So for those who don't know, and you're the best person to explain, what is the Commonwealth Games and why is it important for the city of Birmingham?
Yes, it's hugely important. And I think the first thing to say is, undoubtedly, Ninder, there will be some hiccups. There's just the scale of this project so significant that there will be some challenges along the way. But of course we hope that these games are genuinely transformational for the city, both in terms of reputation and in relation to just everyone being able to celebrate again. But to come back to your question, what is the Commonwealth Games? People might not know this. Commonwealth Games is actually the third largest sporting event in the world.
Wow.
Right? So it's a huge scale. So we're talking about 6,500 athletes and officials in a village. We're talking about 1.7 million tickets.
Wow.
And we're talking about perhaps attracting another 2 million people on top of that into the city for the cultural programme. So this, we believe, will probably be the biggest event that will ever come to the West Midlands, certainly in a generation. So you've got to look at it through that lens in terms of opportunity. And, in terms of that, everyone focuses on the sport, and naturally you do, but I always take that step back and think, well, if the sport goes well, it's what are the other benefits that the region's going to get from that? And I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that later. But it's entirely relevant. The Commonwealth Games has over 1 billion TV viewers from right across, not just the Commonwealth,
That's a big number.
Yeah, we've got significant viewership in the US. We've got significant viewership from China and other countries. And that's because some of the sports in the Commonwealth Games genuinely their biggest events. So things like netball is the Commonwealth Games is the biggest sport. Squash it's the biggest event that you can take part in as a squash player. These are huge sports in countries right across the world. So yeah, this is genuinely a once in a lifetime opportunity for the city and the region.
Now you mentioned some big numbers there. Now, if we looked at the Glasgow version, and you talked about 1,500 staff. So give me an idea of what this means in terms of staff numbers.
Yeah, so probably something quite similar actually in terms of the organising committee here in Birmingham, but to put that in context, so we've got people working right across all the traditional business areas that a lot of your listeners will recognise, so the finance functions, the legal functions, the marketing and the technology functions. We require all of that. But we also have a lot much more specialist people as well, so working on things like catering, cleaning and waste, working on putting up those temporary stands in venues, working on the transport and the security systems. So there's about 64 or so different functions that those 1,500 so people will work across. And the really interesting thing I always think from a business perspective is the organising committee is a company that's set up for a special purpose, which is obviously delivering the games. But what that means is, we were set up here in Birmingham in early 2018 with nothing. So this office didn't exist. We were borrowing some space from the council. We had no computers, we had no bank accounts. Just like all of your listeners who have gone through that start-up phase, they'll know what it's like. Yeah. But the different thing here, of course, is we know that we're also finishing at the end of 2022. So we've got this 4.5-year period. We've got to mobilise, we've got to get everybody ready, we've got to recruit all of those people, we've got to get them trained, know what their roles are, and then we dissolve the company right after the game. So you go through this huge change exercise in a really short period of time, which is the interesting thing, and some people love it, others are a little bit more uncomfortable because everything's changing, there's new people in all the time, but it's a great journey. And in terms of that wider workforce involved in the game, so we focus on the people that report into me, that 1,500 number, but actually on top of that, there's then another 13,000 or so volunteers.
That's right.
And then actually the biggest number is there will be nearly 30,000 contractors working on the game. So that's all the people who work for security companies on venues, for catering companies, for logistics companies, for technology companies. So you have this workforce, I think, of nearly 45,000 people mobilising the games. And someone told me, I think it was the biggest mobilisation of people since the Second World War in the West Midlands. Now there's a thought. So all of that needs pulled together, managed, and all the people in here and across our partners are doing just that at the moment.
Before we look at staffing and all of that, this is a big project, basically. It's a project.
Huge project.
It's a project, start date, and I was going to say, typically we used to have an end date.
Yes.
But of course, COVID changed that. Those end dates changed, and we'll talk about some of the big events where those end dates changed.
Of course.
But let's continue to look at actually running the thing. So you can see how your directs are doing. And you can see that, and on the day or during those 2 weeks, you'll know what's happening. But how do you ensure your volunteers? There's a big number there.
Yeah.
How do you ensure? And this is so hard and so difficult. I'm trying to wonder how you do it. How do you ensure they do the jobs? Because they're volunteers. It's a different motive to be there. They're not.
Indeed.
They're not motivated by money. They're motivated by something else.
Indeed.
How do you keep on top of the volunteering side, the side where you can't really control?
So I think the first thing to say is that motivation piece is actually, I think, the most powerful one. So you have a group of 13,000 people who want to be there. They're doing it, they're giving up of their own time. They're not doing it just because it's a day job or in return for a paycheck. And actually, that means, I think, it's actually easier to manage. You're not trying to convince them to come along to work. They want to come.
They want to come.
So we start off in that process, and you might have seen over at the library, right, in Centenary Square here, we set up this volunteer selection centre. So the first part in making sure that they're effective is getting the right people. So we want people that understand the city and the region, ideally that live here, and most of them do that. Some people who have got some specialisms, we need some doctors, we need some physiotherapists. But then also we just need a lot of really enthusiastic, driven people who've got the time to give to the games. So that whole selection process, we take them through a journey, we take them through interviews. We actually use, believe it or not, other volunteers to do the interviews.
That's good, yeah, love it.
So we go and we ask perhaps retired school teachers or those who've worked in the HR profession, come and help us interview them. So there's a big process around firstly making sure that we take those 45 to 50,000 applications and get a really strong group of people who understand what this Games means to Birmingham and the West Midlands. So we're nearly out the back of that bit. We're just about to offer those roles. And then there's a long period of training and readiness. So we get those volunteers and we bring them along, we explain what their role's going to be. We might even take them to some test events. They'll get to know their managers. We have some volunteers that are still in a structure, so we'll have some volunteers that might have had managerial experience in the past, and we give them a more senior role to look after some of the younger volunteers. And look, even on the ground when it gets to the games, we've got people there looking after them, making sure that they know their role. And if you speak to any of those volunteers who have done previous events, either the likes of London or Glasgow or even internationally, they have the time of their lives. They work hard, they get to meet new people, they get to meet friends for life, and they have the best experience ever. So the Games itself is just a powerful tool, but we've got that infrastructure, to answer your question, around them, both with experienced people in here who have done these kind of projects on volunteering specifically in the past, but we then develop that kind of hierarchy and structure to make sure they're supported, they're trained, and they know exactly what they need to do come that opening ceremony and throughout the Games.
And I suppose, from a reputational perspective, your due diligence has to be something else, because one mistake, people will remember that one mistake, even if it's a volunteer. And then they will do all the positive things. So the due diligence has to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, both in relation to volunteers, our staff,
Yep.
our supply chain. You know, you're right, we're absolutely keen to get the right people and the right organisations involved who will deliver. Now, as I said earlier, it won't be perfect. We will have some of those issues. And actually, the real challenge is, have we got the governance and the flexibility to react quickly? So a lot of what we're talking about at the moment, in particular in COVID, and I know we'll come back to that, is resilience. So what happens if one of our suppliers can't get all the people they need? What happens if we have some challenges and a lot of volunteers pull out? How do we make sure that there's contingency plans that can step in quickly? And of course, in major events, I always say this, even if you think of the run-up to any of them, we had some issues in Glasgow. You might remember some of the issues with security in London. Once the event starts, people start winning medals, people go to sport and experience it. Hopefully a lot of those smaller issues are forgotten and people realise the magnitude of what's in front of them and the real power of it. So we just need to make sure that we try our best not to have the issues, recognise we are going to have some of them. But as I said, perhaps the most important thing is how quickly do we react and make sure we keep the boat going, so to speak, even if we do come across them.
Back to project management. Start date, finish date. March 26th, March 23rd, lockdown.
Yeah.
Did you think, oh my gosh, that finish date?
Yeah, I think probably if we come back to March the 23rd specifically, probably like a lot of people, if I'm being honest, we were sitting there thinking this might be a 3 or 4 week issue.
Yeah, we did the
and
same.
we all thought this is a short-term problem,
Yeah.
we'll get over it. And actually being selfish, thinking, well, at least it's happened now, and we've still got another almost 2 years or 18 months or so to deliver. So actually at that point we probably weren't too worried. But of course as time goes on, you think, wow, look at Tokyo, how it's impacted that event. What does it mean?
The Euros?
Yeah, the Euros, and people
Euros.
starting saying, well, you know, we need to properly plan for this, and what could it mean? So we've been doing that. You know, we've got a dedicated COVID team up the stairs in here, some people with public health experience, others who've worked in events or in ticketing and other things that have been impacted. So they're all working through that. And the real challenge for their job is, I say to everyone, what we love in this industry is certainty, right?
Yeah.
We know where our venues are, we know how many seats we've got, we know how many buses we need to get people there, we know how many people we need to feed. You got all those assumptions locked down and then you deliver. COVID's just brought this whole world of uncertainty. So none of us can know right now what the COVID situation in the UK or internationally is going to be come the 28th of July 2022. I think we're all hoping now it's going to be in a better place.
Yeah.
But it would be naive of us not to plan for some of the challenges as well. So that's what's moved the model, I think, compared with previous games, is a much greater focus on flexibility and being able to adapt, than just following a kind of boilerplate programme. We find a lot of our meetings now end with, okay, let's just do the last 5 minutes of what if. What if there's an issue? What if people can't do X, Y, and Z? What if there's another big variant just before the games? What would we do? So we've got all of those resilience plans in place, but we are now pretty confident that we'll deliver that, you know, full stadia, full live site event. And I'm saying to everyone, despite all the challenges, actually this could be an incredible opportunity for Birmingham. We could be the first major multi-sport event to have those full stadia, to have full live site. And the eyes of the world will really be on us. Okay, how have they made that work? How's that going to happen? And I think could be that big opportunity for the city to really shout loudly about, you know, we've managed to deliver this, and look how great it is.
And I think the Euro finals, particularly in England, must have helped in terms of understanding what they did and what made it work. And there were a few issues. As you said, there were a few issues, but generally speaking,
and look, the latest variant in Omicron's come along. Its transmittability's been through the roof, and we've all got a real fright, I think, by that. But at the same time, live events in England, indoor and outdoor, have still had full capacity. Yeah. So how have they done that? I think they've managed to do it safely, and that's given us real assurance. So even through that challenging time over the last couple of months, we've still been able to put these major events on. And as I say, hopefully, the way the cycle goes, we're in the middle of summer, we aren't in the middle of one of these variants, and actually we're in a pretty good place.
So staying with COVID just for a minute, about leadership and about leading during a crisis, because you know, again, I'll go back to the same thing. The end date suddenly was big question marks.
Yeah.
So how did you, as somebody right at the top, watching this whole crisis unravel, and you're thinking, whoa, hold on, where are people now? They're going to be from home. And of course you got this, and you talked about boilerplate sort of set up, and but surely still getting people in that space, in that zone, as well as delivering a project, you're not having to think about your people, what's making them tick. So how difficult was that? Were you in Scotland or here? Or
I ended up back in Scotland in terms of when we were fully locked down, but what we did in the organisation here, at any point where the government advice was that you're able to work from the office, we were classified as a project that needed integration. So actually our lockdown probably wasn't as long as a lot of other organisations. Okay. However, we had some real challenges, I won't lie to you. So if I let you know that in lockdown number 1, so the March date you talked about, we had 70 staff. And when we come out of that lockdown, back to the office, we had 450. Right? That will give you a sense of the challenge, because pre-lockdown, we were still a small business.
Yeah.
I speak to the staff every week. We do we call it the Birmingham Buzz. I stand up for half an hour and I just tell them what's going on in the business, and some other people come and just so everyone's aware. We create that kind of inclusive culture. So I used to do that on my feet up in the office, and I knew the names and knew everybody of our 70 staff incredibly well. And suddenly we'd moved from that, not anticipating what was going to happen, to how do we create that culture, ensure there's integration across the business, and get everybody up to speed with what's going on in this virtual environment. So, if I always say to people, if this had happened 20 years ago, before the advent of video calling, I think it would all been almost impossible. Yeah. Teams and Zoom and Google Meets and all this, they've been our friend. We've still been able to talk to people. We've still been able to onboard people. We've recruited everybody virtually. We've trained them virtually. Now, it's not been perfect. And the bit I think we have lost some momentum on is that the value of people being able to go over and talk to people face to face informally. So what I thought happened in our business, which I think is the same in a lot of businesses, people moved to quite a regimented calendar. Right, I'm going on a Teams meeting here to talk about X. I'm then moving from that to learn to talk about Y. And I spend a lot of my day when I'm in the office just going over to see, right, what's going on, what are the issues, or someone will come into my office and you deal with things instantly.
Big difference.
And I felt we lost that. And we also lost that because we had all these new recruits, so they didn't have the personal relationships that you would build up if you were in a team and you were getting to know people and you were going out for lunch or you were going for a drink after work. That all left. So we got people back in after the kind of first lockdown, which I think was autumn 2020. And we've been over-indexing as much as we can on that whole physical integration piece, putting in place a lot more informal activity, forcing people to go and see. I mean, we tell people any decision that's made by email from our perspective isn't necessarily a good decision. If you've got something you need to resolve quickly, get off your backside, go and stand at the seat, go and speak to people, or at least pick up the telephone and just talk it through. So we're trying to get away from dealing in an electronic way and getting everybody in here back to that whole personal relationship thing, because on an event like ours, a lot of it's like handovers. So if you think about it, if you work in transport, right, you're focused on, right, how many buses do we need, how many cars do we need, how do we make sure the public transport system's working. But when people got off those buses to our event, the first port of call's going to the security checks. So how are we making sure that the transport people are talking to security people and the governance is in place to make sure that's all fluid and joined up, and then when they go out for security they might walk past a catering tent. So these people knowing each other is really valid, because if there's an issue happens at games time, they need to be able to quickly pick up the phone, know someone they trust, know that they'll get it fixed. And if you're not doing that and you don't have those relationships, then it's really difficult. So that, I think, was our biggest challenge, was the people element of the lockdown, and making sure that they understood their role, and more importantly, they understood what everybody else in the business was doing and forming those relationships.
And did you for a second think, particularly when Tokyo happened, my gosh, we could be the next Tokyo? Did you think that, or did you think, oh no, I think we're still 2 miles away?
I think you always look at some of those doomsday scenarios, don't you, and think, okay, well, what does a games look like if there's no spectators? And I think the first thing to say is I've got huge admiration for everyone that worked in that project. They get pushed back a year. They were working in a huge level of uncertainty.
Huge.
And they still put a world-class event on. Of course, we'd have loved to have seen and heard the noise of the crowd, but they still put on a world-class event despite that. So I think first thing to say is huge credit to them. But is it really what you want to see? Is the real power, as I said earlier, in these things is people celebrating. So you definitely lose something. There is no doubt about that. So yes, was I worried watching that we would have the same? Of course I was. Was I confident that these experts around the world would get us to a much better place by the summer of 2022? Again, I was, and hopefully that's what's transpired. But we've still got those plans sitting away and ready to mobilise if in the worst case we have to do it. But I think as every day goes past, we're more and more confident they won't be needed.
You spoke about this being like a business. You spoke about when you first started, like a startup. So you have a business here that is different in many respects. One, it's got a big project, lots of numbers behind it. But your stakeholders are totally different to most businesses. So
Indeed.
Just some of the stakeholders. So we're in Birmingham, so it's Birmingham City Council. We're part of the combined authority. So
Correct.
Birmingham sits within the West Midlands, so that's another level of politics. We have something called local enterprise partnerships who represent business, and so we have 3, Coventry, Birmingham and the Black Country. You have stakeholders in terms of the people who live, work and play in Birmingham. You have stakeholders who are within 45 minutes of coming to Birmingham, so it's a wider patch. So there's 2 questions here. One is, how do you juggle all them and keep the business running? And my second one is, how do you imbue a sense of enthusiasm from those who are more than 20 minutes away from the city of Birmingham and think it's a Birmingham project?
Yeah. 2 good questions. So I think on the first one around the kind of stakeholder side and how we manage that, I think the first thing to say is, even before the organising committee was set up, the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport in the government, the Mayor and the Combined Authority and Birmingham City Council, they all bid for it. So they all got together, even before I came to town, the organising committee was to think it was a good idea. So that's always a good start. I'm joining an organisation and the overall objective was still agreed between those stakeholders.
Well, I was sitting in some of those meetings.
Yeah,
it
I'm
was
sure
interesting.
you were.
It was interesting when Birmingham said, we're going for it.
And undoubtedly debates about who's paying for what and all of that kind of stuff. But you know what? It was ambitious, it was bold, and I think it was absolutely the right decision. So I suppose I come in starting from a good place. Now, you're right, there are challenges around that because naturally each of those stakeholders that you've mentioned have different priorities, right? Rightly so, the leader of the council's view is I want to get the most out of Birmingham for this event. You've got the mayor wanting to make sure it benefits the full region. And of course, DCMS have a national agenda. So part of the challenge is just making sure that we're constantly listening to them. And they're on a lot of governance forums. We understand their priorities and we make sure that we're putting in place, a scheme and all those vision and mission pillars almost that work for everybody. So it's just simple things like, we went early and said we want to make this the most sustainable Commonwealth Games ever, and that needs to be sustainability in a city level. We need to look at what regional projects we can do, and then of course we're looking at the carbon footprint nationally. And it's just little examples like that of where we're trying to think of all of those stakeholders. But politics sometimes comes into it, and we need to deal with that. But generally, and I've worked in a number of these projects, I actually think it's reasonably that there's a reasonably strong relationship between each of those organisations. I haven't been pulled into too much of that politics side of it, and I think everyone realises that the prize at the end of the day is so big, let's not get in the way of that.
Well, I recall it well because I was a board member of the Black Country Local Enterprise Partnership, and this thing came out, Birmingham want to do it, and how should we get involved? I remember sitting in the West Midlands Combined Authority because I deputised for that chair, and I remember the leader got up and said, we're going for it. And now, if I go back, and Ian, you wouldn't know this, but if I went back about 10 years, this might have been difficult to get off the ground because other than Birmingham, the others, and I'm talking about the other constituents, would have simply shrugged their shoulders and said, so what?
Yeah.
But I think this region works so well together, and all the constituents come back together, and they had the foresight to understand that if Birmingham benefit, actually we all benefit.
Yeah.
And that's why I talked about the 45 minutes, because really it sort of spreads out that way. And I think if anything, there wasn't actually, and you're absolutely right, there was little debate. Nobody really said no, and everybody chipped in. I remember the Black Country Enterprise chipped in with their support, and I think there was people like, wow, this is good.
Yeah.
And then of course it all came. So I think that's partly why I think the games I think are going to be huge. But picking up infrastructure again, stakeholders again. Difficult question here because it's such a cosmopolitan place. How do we engage with everyone? I'm talking about minorities who typically wouldn't get involved in games, and I'm talking about because it's so cosmopolitan. That must have been a challenge.
It is a challenge. We've not always got it right, and I think you're probably aware, Ninder, some of the challenges we've had with the likes of board membership and things like that. That said, where we are now, I think we are doing a reasonably good job in that space, and that's because we do have a wealth of opportunities. So we talked earlier about what will our wider workforce look like, what does a volunteer workforce look like, and we put a huge amount of effort to reach into a lot of communities that wouldn't normally volunteer, and actually a lot of even looking at the age range traditionally of volunteers. So we know Birmingham's a very young city.
That's right.
So if you look traditionally at previous games in the UK, most people that applied to volunteer are retired. And that's logical because they've got time.
They got time.
But we've said, no, that would be such a shame to welcome the world to Birmingham and not have a volunteer workforce who are welcome that genuinely feel and look like the city. So we put a lot of effort into getting young people to apply to volunteer, a lot of effort to make sure that we got volunteers from every single community in the West Midlands. And actually, to be honest, that's our KPI. We've got the demographic breakdown from age, ethnicity, disability, sexuality of the region, and we want to try and make sure the volunteer workforce almost is exactly the same as that. Won't be perfect, but we're pretty close, I think. So the marketing team have done a great job in terms of, you look at the number of applications from under 30s, just an example, it's way higher than it's ever been for previous games. So I think we're making some progress there. In terms of things like the cultural programme, so just to touch on that a little bit, because I think we tend to focus on sport. Of course, it's a huge sporting event, but the cultural programme actually kicks off in the middle of March. It runs for 6 months, right through to September. And it, as I said earlier, could attract up to 2 million people. And it's a great diverse range of activity. It's got the elite cultural institutions in the city, from the ballet and the orchestra and everyone involved, right down to millions of pounds of grassroots grants that are going to a few £1,000s to the local dance company and the Pakistani community and award in Birmingham, right through to people have got bold ideas that are hundreds of thousands of pounds about bringing a lot of people together. So when you start looking at the breakdown of that, which will be announced in probably about 5 weeks' time, it's an incredible showcase of the West Midlands, and I think that's another great example. And then you go through as well the opening ceremony, which I can't divulge too much detail about now. But again, I think when everybody watches it, they'll realise that it showcases that heritage and that diversity of the region really, really well.
To deliver a successful games, to deliver a sports project, requires a lot of partners and requires, at its core, infrastructure. Now, I remember during COVID, there was a general panic. Generally, the tube was empty, buses were empty, a lot of coach companies went to the wall because they were empty. And as infrastructure and transport is so key, has that affected the infrastructure bit, this whole COVID thing, or are we back on track with hotels and hotels suffered? Hotels and infrastructure. Indeed. So are we back on track, or the...
So I think it would be remiss of me not to say it's still an issue.
Okay.
I think there's 2 or 3 levels of infrastructure. Firstly, what's the direct infrastructure we need for the games? And there's 2 major projects. There's Alexander Stadium and the Sandwell Aquatic Centre. And both of those are still on track to be delivered April time, which was always a plan, to allow us a few months to test and get them ready for the event.
I heard the Aquatic Centre is superb.
It's incredible.
I've heard it's
incredible.
World class.
As is the Alexander Stadium.
I've heard it's astonishing.
The region's going to benefit incredibly from both of those venues. But I think we should also mention that it's the city councils in both Birmingham and Sandwell that are managing those, and they've done an incredible job with their contractors to keep it moving through all of this.
Sandwell were really happy when they got that.
Oh, delighted. And as I say, they've done a fantastic job, and they both look fabulous. So I think that core infrastructure, I think, was fine. I think we then go a bit wider afield and think, okay, what's the games relying on in terms of that wider infrastructure? Road networks, roadworks, new train stations, trams, everything else. And again, I think we're in pretty good shape. We'd be naive to say it's not been impacted. And of course, the likes of the example you gave on hotels is linked to the real labour challenges we have at the moment. And that is a big issue for everybody. And I think a lot of your business listeners will recognise
Yeah.
right now, if you're trying to find relatively low-skilled labour in the hospitality market, in catering,
Yeah.
in security and stewarding, it's really difficult. So yes, there is a job to do between now and then, and we need a lot of those staffs for the games, right? So we need thousands of stewards, thousands of catering staff, but of course we also want every hotel to be full, every bar to be full, every restaurant to be full. We want them to get the economic benefit, so they'll need the staff. So you've got a whole region now over the next 7 or 8 months who's mobilising itself to try and attract the same labour. So we've tried to coordinate all that, and this is where we maybe step out of our core responsibility a bit. So for example, I've got a hotel meeting next week where we'll be saying to them, right, tell us what the challenges are, what's the volume of staff you might need. We can look at it in totality and try and join up all our recruitment. If we've got over recruitment for some jobs, we can pass them on to you. So all of that's going on. And again, great credit to the region. Everyone's getting together and trying to look at it holistically rather than competing and cannibalising each other.
Interesting set of things you never thought
Exactly.
back when you set this up. And of course, that never happened at Diddley, the Commonwealth Games, although they had issues with infrastructure, and the Glasgow. Now, we mentioned that the region got together and got behind the games really strong. But there was always, in the background, mumblings of financially, does it tally up? There's a school of thought which says we should be cognizant that the numbers tally. In other words, what goes in comes out, and we're square. Others will say, well, actually, even if we don't, doesn't really matter. One is a legacy and the branding issue we spoke about. So I suppose the question here really is, how does it look financially at the moment? And now that COVID seems to be disappearing, are we going to be back on track?
Yeah. So if I start maybe just with the kind of core games budget, just to give an assurance that you always read horror stories, don't you, about projects like this about going over budget for a variety of reasons. Touch wood, we're sitting at this wooden table here.
Yes.
We get a budget that was set at the bid time. It's still the same budget, and I'm sitting here today still thinking that we'll deliver it for that budget.
Even with inflation at whatever percent it is?
Everything taken into account, we still believe we'll deliver for that budget. Now, if I can
Fantastic.
do that, and the team in finance and the wider business are incredible, I think that's a really firm achievement. But I think the point you were alluding to, which is more important, is okay, that's a lot of money. How does it benefit everybody out there? Now, the first thing I'd say is there has been a lot of work done for previous games around trying to analyse the economic benefit. So if we go back to Gold Coast, they said the economic benefit of their games just to Gold Coast City, not the region, was in excess of £1 billion. And if you looked at it in the wider Queensland, so the West Midlands equivalent, I think there was another £500 million on top of that. Now, we will do that exercise as well, but when I say to everybody regionally to take comfort, right, the Games is funded through 3 vehicles. It's got some local funding, which is primarily Birmingham City Council with some funding from the Combined Authority and other local authorities.
That's right.
And that's less than £200 million. Right? We've got to then raise private money, well in excess of £100 million, and that comes from our sponsorship, our ticketing and all of those. Now the balance, which is £500 million, is from central government.
Yeah.
Right? So if you look at it in no other way around, we're putting over £300 million of contracts out. The majority are going to local businesses. We're recruiting majority local people. We're bringing millions of people into the city to drink and eat at the restaurants and bars in Birmingham and the West Midlands. And that only needs to exceed your local investment, right, for the region to be benefiting. There is no doubt, before we even start, it will exceed that by multiples. So you've got to think, even from a basic equation, what has this Games done? It's levered £500 million of central government money straight into Birmingham and the West Midlands. And it's benefiting its tourism industry, it's benefiting its business, it's benefiting its people. So that's great. But of course, national government want to make sure there's a multiple of that coming back, benefiting not just the region but nationally as well. And that will all be wrapped up as part of that legacy review. But I'm confident it will. But I think from the local perspective, I think the leaders of the council, the mayor and others, to leverage that money in, they've already done an incredible job. And we're already seeing benefits coming through from that.
Now, we heard mumblings about other big sports events that got hit big time by COVID, even if you just take the Premier League.
Yep.
We're talking about sponsors here.
Yeah.
And the sponsors had, certainly in Tokyo, there were a few issues. Did COVID affect the spot, because you talked about the finance and sponsorship is one of those agreements. Did it affect at all? Were there any times where people go, not so sure about this anymore, or was it a case of just wait, let's see where we get to?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is that anybody that signed up to be a sponsor for the Games, none of those ever gave us anything other than full support through all the challenges.
Good.
Recognising, I think, the big prize at the end, but also recognising the fact that the story around this challenging journey is actually probably a good one from a business perspective. How have we managed as a city and a region to get through all this and still produce something spectacular? So great credit to them, they've all stuck with us. Was the market difficult to sell sponsorship when everyone's sitting at home? Of course it was. Yeah. So what I think we found is our sponsorship program's been pushed back a bit, where we thought we might get some more on earlier. They've probably come on 6-9 months later than we thought. But again, and there'll be another few announcements in the next few weeks, we've got some great brands already on. We've got some great brands that are about to be announced, and international brands, which I think is important for the event, because we want this to be viewed as an international city and an international event. And so I'm pretty confident we'll hit that target financially, but more importantly, we'll have really good companies helping us to deliver.
What will success look like for you?
So I've been asked this question a number of times,
okay.
and I always start with the answer of, I'd like to be, sitting a year later, looking back, and people saying incredibly positive things about the city. Right? I think that's the biggest value for me around this. I've kind of watched the effect I thought the Commonwealth Games had in Manchester back in 2002. I've seen it directly in Glasgow, and I think this is genuinely a turning point for the city and the region. It's the international spotlight on it. So if people are looking back saying, wow, I had an incredible time and the city was the best it's ever been during that summer. But you know what? It's allowed my business to grow. We've seen inward investment. People have come, tourism droves on the back of seeing incredible broadcast shots of the city. We've got the Smithfield site, which is a big redevelopment site just south of the Bull Ring. At the moment, if you go down there, it's just a concrete mass, huge car park looking thing. Right, we're going to transform that into the beach volleyball venue, the 3-on-3 basketball venue, a massive live concert site. There'll be merchandise, there'll be hospitality down there, and it'll look incredible. But more importantly, the reason behind doing it is that when the BBC and the international broadcasters are filming those events and that site, the backdrop, is the cathedral, is Selfridge's building, is the Bull Ring. And people start to see Birmingham another light. We're going to broadcast every night from Centenary Square. The backdrop's the library. And it's those things that I think create that real legacy, which is the powerful one about, do you know what? Birmingham was incredibly well placed in the nation in terms of commutability, with people working flexibly. It's a bit cheaper to live in London. It's got an incredible transformation, city centre that's just been transformed. It's got an incredible cultural scene in the back of the Games, and we can showcase all of that as well. It's the home of sport. Suddenly you add all that up, and I think the real power and the real success for me will be that people now have a completely different perception of the West Midlands and of the city of Birmingham in the back of the Games.
It is all about brand Birmingham, which
I agree.
Which I think would be great. Now, we spoke about leadership, and surely, I would have thought by April, May, I'm talking about 2020, people must have said, you've got the toughest gig on the globe. Because you had one of the toughest gigs, without a shadow of a doubt. Tokyo had their own, Euros had their own, and yours was just as tough. So, important, couple of questions then. In terms of leadership, having the toughest gig in the world, 3 tips for people who are going through, have been through, and probably might go through a crisis like that. What should sort of things, 3 things you would give as tips to leaders when they're confronted by a crisis that is out of their control?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is people. For any business, in particular business our size and a lot of larger businesses, it's about looking after and reassuring people. So one of the first things we did, and I mentioned this earlier, is constantly communicate. We understand you're nervous. We understand we've all got uncertainty. They don't necessarily need you to have all the answers, but what they want you to do is reassure them that you're thinking about things, you're putting a plan in place, you're looking after them, their jobs are safe. And if you get that bit right, you get a lot back, right? So I think the first point is, really think about how the circumstances are making that team nervous, how they're concerned about how they can do their job, how you can support them. And that's about delegating down and making sure that everybody's talking to their teams at every level and everybody feels that they get that support. And as I said earlier, there is a direct route as well if they need it straight to me. At the end of that talk I give every single week, we leave 5 minutes and say, ask Ian anything, right? And you can have a moan, you can flag something that's going on in the business that you're uncomfortable about. You can tell us we're doing a brilliant job. We always love those ones. But ask us anything. And people do, and I've had some tough feedback on that, and rightly so, and we've addressed things. So I think that would be my first thing. I think the second thing, and this is probably the hardest bit in the circumstances that we're talking about, is trying to keep a calm head and trying to take the right amount of time, because I think sometimes it's quite easy when you're under pressure and there's a major issue to just try and feel like you need to do something instantly and react right away. And I think the drawing breath advice that I've had before from mentors is a good one around, okay, make sure you're getting firstly a good understanding of what's happening in the environment, secondly what's happening in your business, and getting the right people around you, taking the time, testing the decisions before you go out and decide the strategy to go forward. So I think, as I said in my previous answer, people knowing that you're addressing it, communicating that, but taking the right amount of time before you make a decision on how you're going to go forward. And then I think probably the final point is just around making sure, and this is probably more relevant to my environment, but making sure that stakeholder management, or whether it's from your private sector, your investors, have the confidence in you. And again, a lot of this comes back to communication, doesn't it? But giving them reassurance that you understand the impact on the business and that you've got a logical plan in place is really important. So that kind of investor or stakeholder reassurance, I think, would be another point I would flag.
I asked a similar question, and they said to me, get lots of sleep. So my question to you is, did you sleep well, and what keeps you awake?
I sleep well every night. Do I get enough sleep is the challenge. I mean, I won't lie to you, Ninder. I've definitely seen even just going back post the festive break for the last 2 weeks, it is really full on. We are working long days, and you genuinely do need to be conscious about how that impacts you. I mean, the real danger in this environment is that people are burnt out almost before we need them most, which is neither games time. So on a serious note, yes, I personally and a lot of others are working long hours, but we actually did say to people intentionally, we shut the office down for 2 weeks. And people were going, well, we've only got 7 and a bit months to go. What are you doing? We're saying, well, if you don't get the break now, and we don't force people to get the break now, then they'll really struggle in the run-up. So yeah, I do sleep well. Do we have some issues that should be keeping me awake? Absolutely. But we do need to look. We do, in a serious note, we do need to look after people as well.
I was going to ask you a question about recruitment, but I think you answered that brilliantly earlier on when we talked about volunteers and what the kind of things you look for. So Ian, listen, it's been fascinating. It's certainly the gig that is worth having, but was also worth looking at and worth exploring. It was unbelievable during COVID. I mean, you and I met briefly. And by the way, I think when we talk about culture and leadership and people, I think this is a very great, welcoming place, by the way. I love the way it's set up. Good. The way you can have a cup of tea and snacks. It's fantastic. So I think you've certainly got the layout and you can see people are enjoying themselves. So well done on that. I think obviously when you took the gig on, you had no idea what was going to transpire. and the fact that you're still smiling 7 months away says we're on track. It's been a difficult time, but I think you're doing a brilliant job. And I know you'll do a brilliant job. And I know it's going to be delivered well. And I know the region wants it and will enjoy it. And I think the region will benefit. So I'm wishing you the best from now till August. I know 8th of August, midnight, you'll sleep well. And until then, Ian, listen, thanks for your time. And obviously, I look forward to an article that you'll be writing, similar to what you just said, in the Business Influencer. So I look forward to that as well. Thank you very much, Ian. And listen, enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you, Ninder.
Cheers.